Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Running First in Human and Vaccine Trials in Australia. I'm Arslan Arif, the publisher of Endpoints News. Our panel is sponsored by Novotech today, and I'm delighted to introduce our panel. We have Dr. Jeff Lautet, the Chief Medical Officer at QPEX Biopharmaceuticals. Next, we have Dr. Simon Flight, Principal Consultant at Novotech Biodesk. Then we have Dr. Paul Griffin, Principal Investigator at Nucleus Network, and Stuart Walker, President of COSEC USA. We have an approximately 60-minute session today, a presentation from our panel followed by a Q&A session. Now I encourage everyone in the audience to ask questions of the panel using the Q&A button. For any questions the panel is not able to answer live, we'll attempt to get back to you by email. And now for our presentation, let's start with Dr. Simone Flight. Dr. Flight, on to you.
Thanks, Arslan. So I've been working with Novotech for over 6 years now in Biodesk. Biodesk is a department within the Novotech CRO which specialises in consulting throughout all stages of development and provides strategic advice and regulatory affairs in all of the major jurisdictions. To give you a snapshot of Novotech as a CRO, we were established almost 25 years ago, headquartered in Australia, and have grown strongly into Southeast Asia with close partners in Europe and the US. For those of you who appreciate technical databases, the Novotech team has the flexibility to work across a number of different platforms which are both FDA and EMA compliant in their data presentation. As I mentioned, Novotech has a very experienced consulting team in CMC and all quality, non-clinical and clinical. We primarily work with small biotechs, and we do pride ourselves in finding the most cost-effective and expeditious solutions for our clients. Our principal team has more than 10 years experience each in each of their particular areas of expertise. So from a therapeutic specialty area, we are not particularly specialised in any particular area, but have a wealth of experience across many therapeutic areas. Now, these primarily include oncology, indications, infectious diseases, neurological conditions, but we've also worked on a number of dermatology, respiratory, and also rare genetic orders, to name a few. Next slide, please. So Australia is well regarded as a jurisdiction to commence first in human and early phase trials, there are a number of reasons for this. And you can see from the graphic, there's been a fairly rapid increase in the number of early phase biotech trials that have been initiated in Australia between 2017 and 2019. So one of the great appeals of coming to Australia for first in human and early phase is the very quick startup scheme that we have here. So we don't require, generally speaking, and well over 95% of our trials, we don't require a clinical trial application dossier as the FDA require for the IND and also for clinical trial application for the EMA. Australia also has an attractive cashback incentive for all R&D work that's performed here, which Stuart will talk about in the next couple of slides. Now, as you can see, with what's going on with COVID, I know that there has been an increase in cases in Australia, but to date, the top 10 clinical sites within Australia are still open for either on-site or remote monitoring. And the top 10 are based on the number of trials that have gone through the sites over the last 3 years. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, an appealing feature of Australia, coming to Australia is the rapid startup period. For trials run at private sites, this takes approximately 6 to 8 weeks from application, and approximately 12 weeks for a hospital-based or public site. Now, I should note here that clinical trial preparation and performing of clinical trials in Australia does not require an open IND and is completely independent of the activities that can be performed in the US in parallel. Now, you see from these graphics that the activities that are done over these 6 to 12 weeks between the private and the public sites can, in some regard, be run in parallel, where we do the HREC evaluation and contract negotiations. Regarding the public sites, the Human Research Ethics Committee, or HREC, the typical review takes about 2 months compared to 1 month for the private sites. The public sites also require a research government step, which typically takes about 1 month, which isn't required for the private sites. Now, following approval by HREC or the Ethics Committee, the TGA is just simply notified. So they do no evaluation. It's a simple electronic form, which takes about 3 days to process. We normally allow 10 days before we commence the trial. Now, listed at the bottom of this slide are a number of documents that are required for clinical trials run in Australia and the USA. And the main difference between the two jurisdictions is in Australia, as mentioned, we don't require the clinical trial application dossier. Now, that not only saves time in the preparation of all the documentation, it also means that the amount of CMC information required to be presented is reduced. In fact, in Australia, the only CMC information that's evaluated is that which is presented in the IB. So that doesn't mean that we don't work to the same international quality standards as the US and in Europe. We work to ICH. We're actually an observer of ICH. But it does mean that you will save time and the CMC requirements aren't as great. Certainly with safety, the expectation is that the safety data is equivalent to that which would be acceptable in the US and Europe. And I think if we could pass the slide on to Stuart Walker.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Flatt. I appreciate it, and thank you everybody for joining. I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk with you. I am Stuart Walker, and I work for COSEC Corporate Services. COSEC is a Melbourne-based company with offices around Australia, but also office here where I am in San Francisco, and an office in London as well. I'm here to talk about the Research and Development Incentive Program in Australia. Now, it can be a really significant benefit, but as you just heard, it really should be considered, I think, much more of a cherry on top of the already really significant reasons to do trials in Australia, from the speed with which you can get it approved to the quality of the work, and also just the savings off the bat with regard to exchange rates, etc. So that said, there are a lot of details with regard to this program. I'm going to, in the interest of time, focus on really just three primary factors. Those are going to be, what is the program, a little history about it, how do you get yourself eligible for it, and then which of your costs, which activities within Australia will be eligible for this program. So a little bit of background. The program itself, the research, the R&D incentive program, is 20 plus years old. It's been in place since they started it when the manufacturing sector declined a little bit, and they were really looking to stimulate, the Australian government was looking to stimulate the innovation economy, if you will, particularly life sciences. And the program's been a great success. However, at the outset, it didn't bring a whole lot of foreign investment in, because when they first put the program in place, it was only a tax concession, which means you had to have revenue tax liability in Australia in order to take advantage of it and put your R&D costs against that liability. So for startup companies, life science companies from overseas that don't have any revenue in Australia yet, it was basically a worthless program, which is one of the reasons why about 9 years ago, the government added a cash component to this program. And now that cash component is available to small companies. So there's basically two different aspects to this program. And what is a small company really is the crux of whether or not you're eligible for it is based on your annual revenue. And so if you have, as you can see from this slide, over 20 million Australian dollars of annual revenue, if that revenue exceeds that threshold, then you are eligible for the tax concession, right? So you can take 38.5% of your R&D expenditure and put it against any tax liability you either have now or you might have in the future in Australia. However, if you are under $20 million of annual revenue, you qualify as small, and you are eligible for the cash component, the rebate of this program, which means you can get 43.5 cents back on every dollar you spend in Australia, and you'll get that back as a rebate at the end of your fiscal year. Now, who is eligible, or rather, how do you get yourself eligible? It really boils down to this. There's a lot of reasons to do work in Australia, and you could contract with Novotech, for instance, directly from your parent company and take advantage of all those benefits. But in order to take advantage of the R&D incentive, you need to have an Australian entity. It has to be an Australian entity that signs a contract with Novotech and receives and pays the invoices, and at the end of each year, submits the claim and gets that money back. Now, it's fairly easy to get an entity set up. It can be a wholly owned subsidiary. It's going to be what they call a proprietary limited, a PTY Ltd. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of your parent company. It can be foreign owned. There are no, or really minimal capital requirements. There are no hiring requirements, and you certainly do not need brick and mortar. It's going to be more or less a virtual entity. And importantly, it only takes 3 to 4 weeks to get that entity from zero to fully operational. So you'll open an Australian subsidiary, which will in turn contract with your vendors in Australia. Now, to the third point, which of your activities, which of your expenditures in Australia will be eligible to claim and get that money back? And basically, with regard to clinical trials, the answer is, briefly put, everything. But to put it a little bit more detailed, there are basically two components to your expenditures in Australia. One is considered the core R&D activity. That is going to be your experiment, the trial you're actually running. It's fairly straightforward. However, very importantly, is they also have the category of supporting R&D activities. Now, what that is any activity, provided it's done in Australia, that is either directly related to or in support of your core activity. That those costs will also be eligible. So that includes things like database management, clinical trial insurance, biostatistical analysis, recruitment costs, et cetera, et cetera. So all those costs that you incur within Australia in support of your trial will also be claimable. So that means at the end of each fiscal year, as we submit your income tax return, we can also prepare and submit the claim. Now, the claim is processed at two different departments, one Oz Industry and then over to the tax office. But once it's processed, typically within the first 3 to 5 months of the following year, into your Australian bank account comes that cash rebate, which you can then spend, obviously, on ongoing activities in Australia, or you'll be able to repatriate it. So I know I moved through a lot of details fairly quickly. I'm happy to answer any questions, and you're welcome to reach out to me directly anytime, but I do appreciate the opportunity. And at this point, I'll shift it over to Dr. Jeff Lautet.
Great, thanks very much. So I'm Jeff Lautet, the Chief Medical Officer at QPEX Biopharma based in San Diego. We are a small startup company, started up just under a couple of years ago with 20 employees. It's interesting what Simone and Stuart just said really reflects my experience over the last 6 or 7 years. We've actually done 4 phase 1 studies in Australia and about to start up number 5, 6, and 7. But we went originally into Australia because of the tax credit. And then recognized both the speed and the quality of data generated from the sites and from the CROs. So we've continued to run most of our phase 1 studies in Australia. Our focus is on anti-infectives, particularly gram-negative organisms and resistant gram-negative organisms. And as Simone mentioned, these phase 1 units don't necessarily have to have expertise in your therapeutic area, but they obviously need to have expertise in running phase 1 studies, which they have. On the right-hand side of the slide is just an example of a recent study that we did late last year. And as I said, this is one of many, and just speaks to the speed and I can talk to the quality of the data produced by both, from our point of view, Novotech and the phase 1 unit that we use. So I'll stop there and be happy to answer questions when it gets come to the question session, and hand it over to Paul, I think.
Hi, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this really exciting presentation. So I'm an investigator. I'm the principal investigator at Nucleus Networks Queensland site and the medical director there. And Nucleus Network is a specialised phase 1 clinical trials company, the largest in Australia. We came to be from 2 separate clinical trial companies. So Nucleus Network arose in Victoria in about 2003, and we had QPharm here in Brisbane that had been around for a similar time, and Nucleus Network acquired QPharm last year, and I've been a part of QPharm and now Nucleus for around 11 years. And as you can see by the top box there, we are quite a large clinical trials company with around 140 beds in our Melbourne and Brisbane sites. And one of the benefits of our unit is, or both of them in fact, is that they're co-located with large clinical as well as academic precincts. So in Victoria, it's the Alfred Hospital and the Baker Diabetes and Heart Institute, and up here in Queensland, it's our biggest hospital, the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital, as well as 2 large academic facilities, the University of Queensland and the Queensland Institute of Medical Research. So that puts us in a good physical location to be able to do this work well. We've done, I think it's over 800 phase 1 clinical trials over the time, and given my role, I'm an infectious diseases physician by training. My area of expertise has become mostly vaccine studies as well as anti-infectives. So that's obviously a key focus of ours right now is a number of COVID-19 related trials. We've commenced 2 vaccine trials with the results of 1 released yesterday. The other one's ongoing, and we're in the final stages of preparation for our 3rd vaccine study, and in discussion about a number of others as well. On the bottom left there, you can see that the speed in which we're able to start up clinical trials, partly through some of those regulatory issues that we've already heard discussed, and also our large team of specialist people that can handle all elements of the trial startup process to get it to happen quite quickly. And these timelines have been somewhat contracted in the context of COVID as well. So able to start up some of those COVID studies in even shorter time than that. And as you can see on the right, we have experience with big pharma as well as small biotechs and even some academic institutions. Some of them listed there. We've also done some work for Moderna, who were the first to take a COVID vaccine into clinical trials. So yeah, we've got a long success of doing a large range of clinical trials in all therapeutic areas. My specialty is vaccines, but as I say, we operate in all therapeutic areas with a lot of expertise and experience. And I'll hand back to the chair now. Thank you.
All right, everybody. Yep. Boy, that was a rookie mistake right there. Well, thank you. Thanks to the panel over there. I learned a lot, and we've got quite a bit of time here for the Q&A, which is great. So I have a list of questions here. I'm going to direct them to each panelist here, but I really encourage anyone else with the expertise to come in to really make it a panel discussion, an interactive discussion. I think it's going to be really great for the audience, and we do have some good questions over here. But the first question, I'm going to pose it to Jeff. So how does the process of involving sites in Australia differ from North America? Are there any unique challenges that are faced by sponsors in this region?
Well, I think, so it's a great question. There are some differences from a clinical trial point of view. I think the biggest one is the fact that the phase 1 sites and the CROs are usually separate entities. Many of the phase 1 sites in the United States are an all-in-one commodity, so you get your data management stats, etc., along with your patient care clinical trial, all done by the same group. And in Australia, you have to have the phase 1 site and you have a CRO with it. The good thing is that the CROs we work with, including Novotech, obviously have huge experience with all those phase 1 units, and really their relationship is seamless. But one does have to put together 2 different contracts at the beginning of a trial to set the trial up. I think the other big issue that comes up is just time zones. Obviously, Australia is a long way from the US, but because of the time zones working the way they are, it's actually often only nearly a full 24 hours or between 18 and 21 hours difference. So actually the time zones, even though it's a day off, match up very well. And certainly from the West Coast, we've not found that to be a problem at all. I think the challenges are related to, it's already been mentioned by Stuart, if you're looking for the tax rebate, one obviously has to have a local entity and one has to be able to set that up. And then if you're not, even if you're not looking for the tax rebate, one still needs to have a local sponsor, and usually the CRO can take that role as a local sponsor. So not a lot of differences, and we've been able to, as I said, it's just become part and parcel of what we do.
Okay. All right. Anyone have anything to add to that about involving sites? Any differences between that and North America for the panel here? All right. I'm going to move on to the next question here. This is for Dr. Simon Flight. So how readily are trials conducted in Australia accepted by the FDA and the EMA? I mean, the main regulators in Europe and North America. It's a broad question here, but how does the regulatory really fundamentally differ in Australia and the US? Can you answer that?
Yeah, sure. So trials performed in Australia are recognised by all regulatory jurisdictions and performed within using the good clinical practice. As I mentioned earlier, Australia is an observer to the International Council for the Harmonisation of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use, which is ICH. It's a bit of a mouthful. So coming to Australia for a first-in-human trial to support the opening of an IND or to eventually be included in a package for an NDA submission or BLA submission. That's a very common strategy for a lot of companies, and I'm sure Jeff and Paul can support that as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Simone. We've done studies either not under an IND to talk to the speed piece, but also under the IND, and have filed several NDAs with this data. The reason we keep going back is the high quality. We would not continue to do that if we weren't really impressed with the quality of the data.
Okay. All right. Well, just kind of further along this thing, what about the regulatory framework for biologics in Australia? But actually, the question over here, we'd really like you to focus on perhaps gene therapy products.
Okay. So biologicals in Australia are different to what we would consider to be a biological in the US or Europe or perhaps anywhere else in the world. So products such as recombinant monoclonal antibodies and viral vaccines are not regulated as biologicals in Australia. They're actually just regulated as therapeutic goods, so as new chemical entities. It's the same route. They typically would go down the CTN route and not need to go down an IND type process, which we call a clinical trial exemption scheme over in Australia here. So the only products here which are regulated under the Australian Biological Regulatory Framework, we call it, are products which are derived from human somatic cells. Any germ-line cell therapy is illegal in Australia, as it is in many places. So that really limits biologicals to the kind of CAR-T type cell therapies, which we see quite a few going through. So if you do have a biological or an Australian biological which is a human somatic cell derived product, depending on the level of manipulation, if it's minimally manipulated and the function of the cell hasn't been changed, then you're likely to be able to go down the CTN route. If it's something like a CAR-T cell where there's been quite a significant amount of manipulation to the cell, then you're more likely to have to apply for a CTX, which is, as I say, very similar to an IND. You can actually use the same dossier. And the review process by the TGA, it does take a little bit longer. So with an IND, you're looking at 30 days. With CTX, it's at the moment, at least, I understand it's closer to 3 months. So if we're moving on to gene therapy products, I guess, if we're talking about viral vaccines, most of these tend to be genetically modified organisms. These types of products, almost without exception, require review from the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator. So this is an office in Australia which sits under the Department of Health, as does our regulatory authority, but they work completely separately. So if you're doing any activities with the TGA, you can actually run activities with the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator in parallel. I guess the main piece of advice is to identify very early on in your program what category of genetically modified organism you have, because the evaluation process for GMOs in Australia is relatively lengthy, and we would advise 6 months from beginning to end. So that would be certainly one of the first things to consider if you have that type of product coming into the country.
Okay. All right. Anything to add, anyone? Could we move on to, got several more questions here. All right, this next question is for Paul Griffin here. Here's the question, I'm going to read it. We're often asked about recruitment potential in Australia, given the small population. So can you speak to the challenges behind that? And frankly, how does your center manage to recruit enough patients?
Yeah, so we have a multifaceted approach, I guess. And you know, while our population is small, I think on the whole, we have a subset of our population who are really keen to participate in clinical trials for a host of different reasons. And, you know, fortunately, with the COVID vaccine trials around, there's been a lot of altruism, which has been really good to see. The way we can make sure we recruit our trials is by having a recruitment team with a number of different skills that lends itself very much to being able to generate sufficient interest. So, you know, for example, with one of our COVID-19 vaccines, I believe we had over 4,000 expressions of interest for that study. And, you know, we look really carefully at all of our recruitment data that we generate in terms of where we're getting subjects from and where we might have challenges. And, you know, collaboratively as an organization, we look at overcoming those. So, you know, it's something that we can do quite successfully. And, you know, I guess the other thing about Nucleus Network is that we have 2 sites, one in Brisbane, one in Melbourne. So I believe that's around 7 million or so people across those 2 sites in terms of the population surrounding them. And we move our studies between those 2 sites depending on a number of different factors. So, you know, I think having the 2 sites is a big strength for us. And, you know, again, using COVID as an example, we've seen the epidemiology of COVID-19 change significantly at around our Melbourne site with quite a bit of transmission there. So, you know, fortunately, our Queensland site now has become a bit of a focus for the phase 1 trials for COVID-19 because we have COVID very much under control here. So I guess it's the flexibility and the capability of having multiple sites, as well as having a really experienced and highly skilled recruitment team. And I guess also our reputation as Australia's largest phase 1 unit. We have a lot of expertise. So I'm an infectious diseases physician by training. So that's where I can hopefully apply my expertise to some of the vaccine and anti-infective studies. We have clinical pharmacologists, we have oncologists on staff. So again, I think it's that experience and expertise as well that helps a lot.
Okay. Yeah, I know here in the United States, knowledge of clinical trials and participation in clinical trials is very poor, not where we need it to be at all. And so to hear that the rate might be higher over there, that is encouraging over there. So here, this next question, next one's for you too, Dr. Griffin. We'd like to know the current landscape of COVID-19 vaccine trials in Australia, and if there's a special review process for such applications.
So I'll start with the second part first. In terms of the review process for COVID-related trials in our country generally, the approval process has become as close to real time as practically possible. And you know, having said that, we still make sure we have sufficient preclinical data to support moving any product, including the COVID vaccines, into the clinic. But if that data is there, then we can do things very quickly. And you know, there's an obvious reason for that, and the expectations of the sponsors are that this happens quickly, and fortunately we've been able to do that in the COVID-19 related studies that we've we've commenced. And in terms of the landscape, so we were the first to dose a COVID-19 vaccine in the Southern Hemisphere, I believe, with the Novavax vaccine. And there's been some exciting data that they released yesterday that I'd refer people to have a look at. We'd actually been involved in the University of Queensland vaccine program since before COVID existed. So we were helping them a little bit with a program to respond to a new or novel pathogen. So we've been working with them for a few years. And fortunately, we got to the stage of taking their vaccine into the clinic around 3 or 4 weeks ago. We're in very mature discussions with another vaccine manufacturer, and hopefully we'll have some announcements in the near future there, and in various stages of discussions with a host of other vaccine manufacturers that are producing COVID-19 related vaccines. So it's exciting. There is 2 other vaccine studies, I believe, that I'm not involved in, that have commenced in this country. One in South Australia and one in which is a South Australian vaccine, very small study. And in Western Australia, I believe a US company has also taken their vaccine into phase 1 trials at another phase 1 unit. So again, reflecting, I think, what has been presented in this talk from all the presenters, that, you know, Australia is a great place to do early phase research, and that's what we're seeing with COVID-19.
That's very exciting. That's very cool. Thank you for that overview.
Solon, can I have one comment?
Please do.
Yeah, I think Australia deserves huge praise for how well they've handled COVID-19 cases. And yes, there are increases in Victoria at the moment, but even despite that, as we've looked around, essentially, as Simone said, all the phase 1 units are continuing to work and run trials in Australia. That is not the case in the US, for instance, at the moment. So huge credit to Australia for getting on top of it.
Yeah, I concur. So here, the next question, we've got one on the R&D incentive program. I think that one's going to be for Stuart. So what's the timeline and process of setting up that Australian subsidiary that you were talking about earlier?
That's an important question. So I mentioned briefly that it's fairly straightforward. It's a quick process. And the fact is that for instance, our clients who are going to be doing trials in Australia, what I will say is this: you don't need to set up a subsidiary in Australia until you've made some decisions. Like you're going to do work in Australia, you've chosen which CRO, you're going to work with Novotech, you've decided to work with Nucleus. Now you got to sign some contracts so that you can actually start commencing that work. It only takes us 3 or 4 weeks to go from 0 to fully operational with an Australian subsidiary. We do need some documentation from you, and it's not easy to get, especially sometimes these days. To get a notarized document can be kind of a hassle, but for the most part, it really does take only about a month to get set up. So what we tell folks is, you know, I'm happy to talk with you and help you all the way through, but you don't engage a company like COSEC until you're about a month away from signing a contract in Australia, at which point we can create a subsidiary, and then it will be that sub that's on paper on that contract with your vendors down there. So that's the short answer. Obviously, all the documentation and details and that time of getting it from our clients is built into what I've just said with regard to 3 or 4 weeks.
Okay. Right. Here, I've got the next question. It's for you, Jeff. From a sponsor's perspective, what are the top features that have drawn you into doing trials in Asia?
Initially, it was money. Small startup company looking for that tax rebate, setting up that group subsidiary in Australia. But we went through the process and were able to get it done. Now with our company, we're lucky enough to have BARDA funding, and so we can't go that route looking for a tax credit from the Australian government. And so now we just need the local sponsor, and it's all about study quality, making sure that you have a great relationship with that PI at the site. And I've been so impressed with I'm speaking to Paul here now, so impressed with the quality of the medical monitors at the sites and developing that strong relationship. So quality and speed are the 2 components that really draw us there now.
So if I heard you right, it was first money, but then once you got there, it was quality and speed after all.
Yes. Now, the other thing I should just say, so I'm a New Zealander, and as you know, New Zealanders have friendly rivalry with Australians. So I've always said to my teams, I'm always happy to experiment on Australians. So maybe there's a fourth group.
Oh, that's a good one.
As a fellow New Zealander, I agree.
Uh-oh, Paul, you're outnumbered. I'm sorry.
Scary.
Right. You know what? While you were giving that answer, Jeff, I had another question pop up for you, Stuart, and it's again about the R&D program. So, once that subsidiary is set up, what are the options available for it? That's what the question says.
Okay, you know what so I think what you mean is basically you've set up a subsidiary, maybe you've had a first in human trial or an early phase trial, and then you've come to the end of it, and you've got your data, and you know, maybe you don't have any further activities in Australia. So what you can do at that point is you've got a subsidiary down there. It's been set up. You do have some options. What a lot of our clients are doing, as Dr. Lautet said, might do a trial on one particular candidate, and then find that doing work in Australia is terrific, and they've got another candidate coming down the line, or maybe they could even do, you know, some sites of a phase 2 down there. So what can happen with a lot of our clients is they'll do an early phase or a phase 1, and then they'll put their subsidiary at the end of those activities into dormancy. So basically that means like the cost of keeping it up and running is minimal, and it can just sit in dormancy until such time as you need it, and you've got an additional trial or another candidate you're going to be working on, and then we can just spin up your Australian subsidiary and then use that as the sponsor and to make the claim on that R&D incentive. So that's one option. Now another one is, of course, like, you know, if you're done and you have no further activity down in Australia, we do have some clients who will at that point put their subsidiary into dormancy anyway and just leave it sit down there until such time as perhaps, you know, maybe they have an exit event or something like that, and there's some real cause to go through the process of shutting it down. But you can really at any point shut it down. It does take a little while. It takes 3 or 4 months. There's a $3,000 cost to shutting it down with regard to fees to the government, et cetera. But you know, it's fairly straightforward, and you do have that option of closing shop and just going home.
Okay, let's say that you did do this, though. Let's talk about some sticky issues. What about IP considerations? Are there anything like that that the company should be aware of if they're going to set that up?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really important question, and obviously that's where a lot of details come in, and I don't want to take too much time, but I'll put it this way. The most important thing that companies will want to ask is about their IP, both the base IP, right, that's getting used in the trial, but also what they call the developed IP, or the DIP. You have some options and how to treat that, but typically our clients will select a model for the structure between their parent company and their Australian subsidiary, wherein the base IP is licensed to the subsidiary for the express purpose of running the trial, but no legal title is sent down there. And also, we're able to structure it such that the developed IP, the legal title to that developed IP, also vests back with the parent company. Now, it will be kind of automatically relicensed to the subsidiary for ongoing trials, but the developed IP and the base IP can remain with the parent company. There are some other considerations with regard to commercialization rights and whatnot. Now that can take a few minutes. I'm more than happy to talk with folks maybe afterwards about that, but really importantly, that IP basically remains at home.
Okay. All right. Now, I've got a question, and here's my question for the whole panel here. Now, I'm going to ask, as an American, and we can keep the political stuff out of it, but let's just talk about the sites. It seems like the sites in Australia and Asia have adapted well to COVID with minimal disruption. Let's talk about sites, and can the panel talk about any kind of reasons that they've adapted well to that? Anything that the audience can take, any kind of tidbits when running sites for that?
Go ahead, Paul, please.
No, Jeff, please.
Well, maybe you should respond because I'm an American along with Solon at this point. But I think it's Australia and New Zealand have really done a great job. It's obviously beneficial to be an island that you have to get to via either boat or plane. And if you can keep your numbers down, then you can do contact tracing, right? And that's really been, and Paul, you can agree or disagree, but to me, that's really been how they've been able to get on top of it. And obviously they're getting their tests done quickly, getting the results back, able to do the contact tracing, and then track down those people. So I think once you get to that point and you can keep your borders intact, I think you're in good shape. And so now there is variability across the states in Australia. But Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that, for instance, the border between Victoria and South Australia, or ACT or New South Wales is shut at the moment, so people can't go back and forth outside the state.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's a really good summary. So you're right. We've got excellent control in this country overall. We've seen a little bit of a bump in the road with Victoria, and I guess that's one of the things that makes it fortunate for us to have two sites. So we can now pivot a little bit and have phase 1 trials as a real focus. Speaking of regards to COVID of our Brisbane side, and then we've got, I guess, capabilities in Victoria to look at later phase studies, given that there is significant community transmission. So yeah, I think our epidemiology and how well we've handled in this country's been a huge strength generally. And then I think, for example, speaking from a unit perspective, we were very aggressive in implementing a very rigorous infection control program within our site that includes, pre-screening of staff and volunteers. We included some remote monitoring, as well as the capability to assess subjects remotely into a lot of our clinical trials. And we're doing temperature screening, staff are wearing masks. So we've got a really rigorous internal policy to make sure that we protect all of our staff so we can keep staffing our clinical trials, and obviously protect all of our volunteers so that we can keep running at the important work that we're doing throughout COVID.
Excellent. Excellent. Here I am sitting in the state of Kansas, where our state legislature has banned the governor from doing contact tracing. So bless you all over there. So, okay. Let me ask you, we've been talking a lot about these early phase trials, doing them in Australia. Is it possible to stay in Australia and Asia for the later phase studies? What does the panel have to say about that?
So we have, over the years, conducted several global studies and included sites in Australia and New Zealand with good success. I think they're unlinked, obviously, to the phase 1 sites we're discussing here. But Novotech, for instance, is Asia Pacific wide, and as a CRO, often we've had, instead of one global CRO, regional CROs, and that's worked out well for us.
And I can maybe add to that. I think Australia is also an excellent place for later phase studies. And, sometimes earlier phase units like Nucleus can help with the phase 2 and even the phase 3 studies. But then, we have a lot of collaboration with a lot of academic and clinical institutes. Both of our sites are co-located with both of those. So, the ability to cross over and add clinical sites to later phase trials is something that we do fairly readily. So I think the capability generally for that in Australia is good too.
Okay. All right. We have a quick question here on fun one, regulatory pathways. I think this one's going to be for you, Dr. Simon Flight. So you mentioned CTN and CTX regulatory pathways. Which one is most frequently used?
By far the CTN pathway. As I mentioned, only what we call a class 4 biological really has to go through the CTX pathway, and that's a human somatic cell that's had major manipulations, such as the CAR T cell, CAR NT cell type therapy. I think I did hear a stat, so I'm going to start throwing out numbers which might not be right, but maybe a year ago somebody mentioned that of the last 4,000 trials that were set up, 4 of them were CTXs and the other 3,996 were CTNs. So that'll give you an idea of the TGA don't see these applications very often. I think it's fair to say in the past they have stated on their website that they have a 50-day review timeline, and that doesn't include clock stops. But in reality, maybe just with the experience of the team at the TGA, they tended to look at the CTX applications as a marketing application. So we're asking for a lot of data, much more than you would expect for an IND. I think that has improved over the recent years. So especially now they are probably seeing 3 or 4 of them a year.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you for that. Here we have another question pop up, and it's about the R&D cash refund. So again, for you, Stuart, maybe you can share some examples of how easy it is to set up the Australian entity to tap this R&D cash refund. I'm guessing you can't actually talk about specifics or anything like that, but maybe you could walk us through an example of a deal you've done like this.
You know, what I'll do is actually we'll talk about a fairly recent one again without, am I on mute? Sorry.
No, we can hear you loud and clear.
Thank you, I apologize. A fairly recent example, again, without sharing the company name, but it was during the COVID era, and a company that had a trial interrupted, an ongoing US trial interrupted because of COVID, and obviously wanted to continue it as quickly as possible, and found Australia. And wanted to get that cracking, right? So they found a CRO, they found a site, they were ready to go forward. And at that point, did they learn about the R&D incentive program? So they were down the line and ready to move forward, and came to us via introduction. In that circumstance, this is a sort of a unusual case. Obviously, it's usually not quite so rushed, and usually it's like Dr. Lautit's experience where, you know, they know about the money and then they come to Australia. But this was a case where what we were able to do is incorporate a subsidiary in Australia. Basically, that means get what they call an Australian company number, an ACN, and an Australian company name in like 2 business days. I mean, it's quick. But that means that company or that entity can sign a contract and everything can start moving forward. But in those circumstances, the CRO, the sites, et cetera, need to be a little patient because you know, that entity is not going to be able to receive or pay invoices till we do the rest of the process. But what we're able to do is then try to move things as quickly as we can. We are, of course, working with the tax office, you know, and it's quicker than the IRS, but it's analogous to the IRS. So that process does typically take 3 or 4 weeks to get some of the other registrations in place. And obviously opening a bank account, there's really very few ways to hurry that along. But the process can be a little flexible when need be, in terms of like getting an entity established and then dealing with the rest of it as necessary thereafter. So that's again, somewhat unusual circumstance, but one that just in the last couple of months came up for us because Australia ended up being a really good place for these folks to do their ongoing trial, unrelated to COVID, but going to Australia because they couldn't continue it here.
Okay, thank you. Insightful. We keep having questions come up from the audience, so I really thank you for that. Keep going. We have just about 10 minutes left here, and we have several more questions left. I have one here for both Dr. Simon Flight and Dr. Paul Griffin. What is the share of your work conducted with biotechs compared with large pharmas or other type of sponsors? What's the breakdown between the different types of sponsors you work with?
We probably have different responses to the same question. Within Novotech, so without going into a lot of detail, we have an institutional biosafety committee, and that's probably where we interact with the big pharma, more so than the small biotechs. But I would say by and large, our work, which of CRO work, is primarily small biotechs. The larger pharma tend to have their own clinical operations teams.
Yeah, thank you. It's Paul here. I couldn't give you any figures, and I think it fluctuates depending on you know, what sort of products are in development. We work with you know, small to larger biotechs, big pharma, as well as even some academic institutions. So you know, we have a fairly wide spread of sponsors, and you know, across all therapeutic areas. I think we probably focus a little bit more most of the time on the biotech space, but as I say, from time to time, do quite a bit of big pharma work as well. So yeah, I couldn't give you an accurate figure, but it does fluctuate a little bit depending on the situation.
Okay. Well, how about while I have you here, Dr. Griffin, another question for you. Tell me Here's a question from the audience. What are the most exciting developments that you see in vaccines today?
Look, clearly COVID-19 is an unprecedented situation, and I'm still amazed at how quickly we've developed so many good vaccine candidates. And that's happened in record time, and the data that's now coming out of the phase 1 and phase 2 studies is very impressive. So just being a small part of that, or even being an observer of that, in fact, is really exciting. And now I'm just really looking forward to those progressing through the phase 2 and phase 3 studies, and hopefully we'll see some vaccines that show some real world protection in those later phase studies. But as I say, every vaccine technology has been applied to COVID, and we've had some great successes getting them into and through the early phase trials, and we've been really excited to be a part of that.
Okay, great. Speaking about vaccines, here's a regulatory question about one, a quick one for you, Dr. Simon Flight. Are viral vaccines considered GMOs in Australia? Does that impact the regulatory pathway for viral vaccines?
Yeah, I can probably think of maybe one example where we had a viral vaccine that wasn't a GMO. Generally, if it's been modified using any gene technology techniques, it will be considered a GMO. And there are, and I do welcome questions which I can answer personally after this webinar. There's quite a number of considerations as to how they're classified and therefore how they're regulated. But we have spent many years, Dr. Griffin's on our IBC as well, so he's very familiar with all of these products that have been coming through. But yeah, generally speaking, the viral vaccines are generally considered GMOs if they've been modified in any way, in which case they need to be evaluated by Office of the Gene Technology Regulator. Just to add to that, and again in the COVID situation, there always has been a little bit on critical path with regard to how quickly we can get studies into Australia. And we've recently had a COVID candidate that's a GMO, and that they've reviewed that in record time. So I think it's all hands on deck with COVID. They're happy to, we're reviewing in real time and talking to them on a daily basis. So
thank you. Okay. All right. All right. We have just a couple minutes left here, so I'm going to try to squeeze in just 2 questions here. Let's go to you, Dr. Jeff Lautet. Have you ran trials in Asia as well? Would you consider Asia?
So our focus is on resistant organisms. And so the answer to that, therefore, is obviously yes, because there's a high percentage of resistant organisms in certain countries in Asia, not so much Australia and New Zealand, but other countries in Asia. So yeah, we have both a lot of interest and some experience in running trials in Asia as well. I haven't done any phase 1 trials outside of Australia or New Zealand, though.
Okay. All right. And actually, let me pose you the last question for our panel today. And I'm going to pose it to you, Dr. Jeff Lautet. If you can provide just 1 or 2 pieces of advice to biotechs looking at a trial in Australia, what would they be? What would you want to tell yourself before you came to Australia? Give us some key advice.
So you're asking me what would I tell my board is probably the right question. From near term, I think first off, it's coming up to be the summer in Australia and New Zealand, and so highly unlikely there will be a double whammy of both flu and COVID. So my expectation is that Australia will continue to do very well controlling COVID and won't have flu cases at the same time. So near term, I would look at Australia and New Zealand as optimal places to consider doing phase 1 studies. And then longer term, it's all about speed and quality. The quality of the data is excellent. We've been able to use it in several of our NDA filings and actually approvals. And so I highly support the use of conducting phase 1 trials in Australia and New Zealand.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, I think we're going to conclude today's panel. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, the entire audience as well. Thank you for Novotech to bringing yet another great discussion to the Endpoints News audience. I'm really thankful for that. Thank you, Dr. Simone Flight. Thank you, Dr. Jeff Lautet, Stuart Walker, and Dr. Paul Griffin. For Endpoints News, I'm Arslan Arif, and I wish everyone a great rest of their day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.